everybody, welcome to the first lab video for our Sew It Seams sewing class, making the framing rail fence pattern. So tonight we're going to do a little bit of cutting, which is the first part of quilting and also my least favorite part, but something that you have to do. Apologize for being a little tardy. Driving 2 hours back home takes, I left a tad late, but I'm here and good to go. We are ready to go. So the first thing that we have to do when we get to cutting fabric is, number one, you have to choose the fabric that you want to have each piece with. And I like to label it because if you put a project down for any length of time, you need to know what you're doing when you pick the project back up. So if you're just joining us tonight, we're cutting, which is an exciting part of quilting. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my fabric for the squares and then the framing rail pieces, and then I have fabric already purchased for the two outside borders that I will label later on. All right, so just to let you guys see here what we're doing. Here's my four pieces of fabric here. This is the fabric that I went to the store and fell in love with. So this is going to be my squares. And then I have 3 pieces of fabric right here that's going to make the other part of the quilt that's called the framing rail. So this piece right here with the 3 layers. So this is going to be my solid square. These 3, not necessarily in this order, are going to be the other part of this, okay? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to unfold this piece of fabric and go on over to my ironing board, which is another important part of quilting, ironing, which really sucks because ironing sucks. So I'm going to unfold the piece of fabric here. And when you're doing that, just keep in mind that you are going to be cutting this eventually. Sorry for the bad video there. So you're going to be cutting this eventually. So the first part that I'm going to use to cut, I am not going to use the entire piece of fabric. So this excess over here that I have, I like to fold it up neatly in some fashionable manner there, but we're only going to iron the part that we're going to use. I want to use part of this piece of fabric as a border to kind of tie the whole quilt together. All right, so this over here is your seam line. This is very important. So as you guys can see, not all of this is exactly together. So when I make a quilt, this is cut from the fabric store. I don't care what fabric store you go to, they are not going to cut it straight enough. And then also another problem that you run into if you make a quilt with a friend is that everyone cuts differently. Everyone judges a cut differently. So you need to make sure that you are the one that's cutting. Same thing with sewing. Everyone follows the line differently. So if you're going to make the quilt with a friend, one person needs to cut, one person needs to sew. It just makes it easier. It'll make the quilt line up better. But this is an unstraight line, which is always going to be at the fabric store because they give you a little extra so that you can cut off what's called the excess at the end here from your cut. So the first thing we're going to do is just iron this piece of fabric. And you might ask, why in the heck are we ironing fabric? So as you can tell, this is kind of wrinkly. And things, especially like this here, if you cut along this edge and then, try to use this piece is going to fold up because of that wrinkle. So the wrinkles make things not so easy when you're sewing. So you want to try to get rid of them. All right, and you're going to need a really hot iron. I do not have an industrial iron. That's technically what you're supposed to have. I just have this nice, it's a Black & Decker. I just got it because my other one broke on me, which happens quite frequently, believe it or not. So we're gonna fold this, and then just be cautious as you're ironing, not to push down really hard and move the fabric, because you want it to stay sort of together with the other piece. So whatever you iron, we're not going to do a lot of moving. You're also not going to unfold the entire part of the fabric. So as you can tell, this is 2 layers of fabric. It just makes it easier to cut, because if you unfolded this entire piece of fabric, it's going to be longer than any cutting board you could ever find. And that makes it a lot harder for you to cut. So if you leave it folded like this, you can cut nice straight lines and use any sort of cutting mat that you have. So we're just ironing the fabric, pretty easy. I think everyone knows how to iron, I hope. If not, you just put the hot iron on the fabric and go to town. It's pretty simple. But you just want to make sure as you're ironing that you're keeping this lined up as much as possible, and you're keeping the bottom here lined up as much as possible. All right, so we're just ironing. There we go. So that should be good enough for the first part. So tonight we are going to start cutting the squares. So we are cutting 6.5-inch squares for the 6.5-inch squares is what we have for this particular quilt. Everything is different, and then you're gonna have a different size once we get to the other piece of fabric. But I think for this week, we're just going to cut the squares, and once we get done cutting the squares, then we'll cut what's called the rails of the quilt. All right, so I'm gonna put my other 3 pieces of fabric away because I'm not gonna do anything with them tonight. And I'm going to get my cutting stuff ready, get my cutting stuff out so that I have it available, line this up on my cutting board, get it ready. You want to make sure that everything stays as straight as possible as you can get it. And like I said, the excess fabric, like you have over here, just sort of fold it up and keep it nice and piled over there. It's not going to be super important what you do with that, but just line this up. All right, so now I'm going to show you what it looks like when we have it lined up, what I use to line it up, because that's pretty important. All right, so this is my cutting board. So as you can tell, this right here is not straight. So I like to make sure that I am in line up here as straight as it can be. So you don't want to put it all the way up here to this top, because then you can't see relative to how it's going up there to the bottom. So I'm going to take this is like a guide, what you're going to use to keep the straight line on your fabric there. So I want to be able to see on the board this piece and this piece. So I need to adjust this a little bit. I'm going to get this out of the way here. So I'm just going to adjust it a little. It's not going to be quite as easy because this piece of fabric is actually pretty long. So the most important part is that we have it lined up down here, and then you can use a couple different tools as we go along to keep it straight in other aspects as far as the top and the bottom. But just keep this as straight as possible. It looks straight to my naked eye. There's not that much difference in the top and the bottom. Same thing down here. Keep it straight, keep it going. So the most important part is that we're going to use this yellow line right here as a reference, okay? So this is going to be the reference. And like I said before, the lady at the quilt store is busy. the lady at the quilt store is not taking a ton of time to make sure that she gives you a straight piece of fabric so that you can go home and immediately start quilting, because she is busy, she has other things to do, and she just can't guarantee a straight one every time. And like I said, everyone cuts differently. So we are going to straighten this line up. Even though it appears straight, it's not. We found a couple of little nooks and crannies there that we see that's not straight, so we want to straighten it up ourselves. So to do that, you just line this up. All right, so I am looking. I am going to go ahead and cut a large piece so that it's easier for you guys to see. I don't usually like to waste quite this much fabric, but it's lined up with this line right there. All right, so as you can see, that's how I judge my line. I can still see the line with the ruler, but it's a little bit on top of it. Like I said, everyone cuts differently. You might cut differently than this, and that's fine. So we just come down along through here. And I just want to make sure that it looks like it is lined up with this line as well. So it's a little hard to tell because the fabric is covering it up, but the lines are actually different lengths. So the one that I'm using is the thick line, which you can tell I'm lined up down there. Got to move it a tick. All right. So the next part is super important. We're going to make sure that we are going to cut straight. So if you guys did not get this Quilter Select ruler that I have at the bottom that has the sticky stuff on the bottom, you need to make sure when you're quilting that you're keeping this pinky finger to the outside, and you're gonna actually have to kind of shift upwards as you use your rotary cutter to cut. All right. And these rotary cutters are sharp, but fabric is surprisingly harder to cut than you would think it would be. So you're gonna have to apply nice even pressure as you go upwards. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but just nice even pressure. You want to keep the rotary cutter against the ruler as much as you can, because it's going to be pretty easy for you to get a little wobbly. And like I said, this is why we got extra fabric. You can mess up, you can do other things if you have the extra fabric, but getting used to cutting with one of these is a little bit of a learning curve. All right, a little bit of a learning curve going on there. So let me see if I can get this situated so that you guys can see me do a cut, because it will probably be helpful. And then I'll help you line up the size of the squares that we need. And then you can just go to town and I'll be here to answer questions. All right, so I'll do a couple of different cuts and then I'll let you go. All right, but I'm gonna get this set up, so just bear with me for 1 second. Let's see here. Can you see if I do that? It's a little, let's see here. I think I'm actually gonna have to get maybe like a bipod or something for my phone to make it a little easier. Let's see. What can I use to lock my phone up here? There we go. All right, let's see. Can you see me cutting? No, I gotta shift it a little more. All right, there we go. I think that's pretty good. If you can't see, let me know. All right, so as you guys can see, I'm keeping this pinky finger on the outside of the ruler to ensure that it stays straight. All right, so you just press down. I like to keep my forefinger here on the tip of the blade just to give that little bit of extra pressure as you're going forward. So you just start cutting, and then see how I pause and then move my hand as well. And then right here at the very end is really important. That's where the ruler likes to shift. Do it one more time. All right. So then you're going to get a nice clean cut like this. It's going to come straight off. This is what it looks like with my ruler. You can see that there's no fabric on the edge. Huh. And you know what? That doesn't look straight. So even sometimes if you are super duper careful, it still doesn't look straight. So I'm going to have to do another one, which is fine. I have plenty of extra fabric, and you guys can learn from the experience as well. So we're going to line up. Oh, I lined up with the wrong line. That's fine. All right, there we go. So I'm just going to make sure. So this time I'm going to do a really small line to ensure the straightness. All right, it's going to be a really small line. Really small amount of fabric coming off here. Let's see. Find this line up here, make sure it's the long one. Yep, there we go. All right, that's the one up there. This is the one down here. All right, I'm gonna do it one more time. All right, here we go. One more time. Oh, good grief. All right, there we go. Here we go. One last time. Cutting. Keeping it super close to that ruler. As close as I can get. And sometimes, all right, so here's another thing. Sometimes, even if you cut and put a lot of pressure, sometimes there's like a nick in the blade, or, you know, something happens and this is not coming up. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. This is like the worst thing ever. No, it's not. It's fine. You just bring it up and slice it right along there, and it'll come right up, all right? So it's not that big of a deal. If it happens again, that's fine. Happen again there. And trust me, my mom did a quilting class with my grandmother, Tilly, and that was her largest complaint. Her largest complaint was the cutting and getting used to making sure it stays even and that it cuts along the way. She had a lot of trouble with that. You just can't be afraid to apply the pressure. Apply a ton of pressure as you go along. It's no big deal, really. And you know what? This is a new skill for most of you. So, you know, if you don't get everything perfect the first time, it really isn't that big of a deal. Like, it's fine. You can't do everything perfect every time. And with quilting, there's a little bit of allowance. Now, if you're a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch off with your cuts, that's not going to be quite so kosher. But there is a little bit of stretching and things that you can do to ensure that your quilt still turns out great. All right? So now that we have our line that's finally nice and straight, okay, we've got that nice straight line. So this is our cut on this fabric, all right? So we need, for this project, 6.5 inch squares. All right, so you might ask, Lauren, how in the heck am I going to figure out how big 6.5 inches is from this piece of fabric just sitting here? Like, that's just crazy. All right, you have one of two things that you can do. I know that most of you probably have some sort of ruler laying around the house, or a lot of you might have gone ahead and gotten a smaller ruler like this. If you got a cutting mat, okay, like the one that I have, the green thing, you can count, all right? So you can count 1, 2, because these squares are an inch, so you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then this little notch here is a 1/2. That is a 1/2 inch notch right there. All right, so you can just, at this point, go ahead and lay your ruler down at that 1/2 inch notch and make it straight and go for it. I like to be a little bit more precise than that because, you know, I do this more than just my first time. But you are totally awesome if you want to do that as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is so we counted our notches. Here's our 6.5 inch mark. You can have a regular ruler, you can measure it, 6.5 inches. That's what I'm going to show you now. So I have this nifty little bitty ruler that tells you all sorts of measurements up to 9.5 inches. All right, so we need 6.5, and the half is gonna be this black line right here, okay? So a couple of the things that I'm gonna do to help ensure that this stays straight, all right? Look how straight that cut is along that black line. So I did a pretty good job cutting there. I also wanna make sure that the black lines going horizontal. Check out that math word. My mom was a math teacher, so way to go me. I'm gonna make sure that they are straight horizontally and vertically, okay? Make sure that everything is straight that way. So then I can come over here and just align one ruler next to the other. All right, so I'm just gonna take this ruler, scoot it over a little closer to this one, all right? And since this is straight, well, I moved it when I moved the other ruler, but since this is straight, both horizontally and vertically, there we go, then this one is most likely straight, but we still make sure because we want the best and most accurate quilt possible. So a really good term, if you take your quilt that you make this time, and you take it to the quilter and they compliment you, they say, wow, your quilt is so square, but your quilt is a rectangle. Yeah, we're making a rectangle quilt. We're not making a square quilt. Well, if they compliment you and say, wow, this is so square, that means that you're really accurate, okay? The center of the quilt matches up. So when you are done and you fold it and it folds in half and then folds in half again and it meets up at every corner, it's really square and you did a really good job. Okay? So that's what they mean by that. Don't take it offensively because they're not. They're giving you a compliment. All right, so we're lined up here at this line and we're going to come down here. And let's see, are we lined up here at this line? All right, so this is on a 1/2 inch mark. So let's ensure that this is also on a 1/2 inch mark. So 25, all right, so the 1/2 inch mark is actually going to be right there because I peeked under and made sure. All right, so we're lined up. We are lined up. We have this little ruler here telling us that we are lined up. Now I gotta adjust it a little bit. There we go. All right, so a lot of this is literally just being as precise as you possibly can. Okay, so as precise as you possibly can. All right, so now we're gonna get ready here to do another cut. All right, so here we go. I'm just double checking that everything is lined up. All right, so another really important, really super, super duper important thing for you guys to know is that in quilting, you measure twice at least, and you cut once. Because once you cut the fabric, you can't put it back together. So if this 6.5 inch square or strip of fabric turns out not to be 6.5 inches, there's nothing you can do about it unless you're lucky enough to be able to use it in a different part of the quilt. Okay, so if you cut it 7 inches instead of 6.5, you can cut it back down, but then you've literally wasted a 1/2 inch of fabric, okay? And now that you guys have purchased some fabric, you know how expensive it is, all right? So we're just gonna make sure one last time that we're making a 6.5 inch cut. Everything is lined up so that it's straight. I also like to move this up and down, make sure that it stays lined up with the fabric. All right, so I'm finding a little bit of discrepancy there, so I'm just gonna adjust it off. All right, so now that I've checked, double checked, rechecked, 3 times checked, I'm gonna cut. All right, so until you've checked and checked and checked and checked and checked, don't cut. But now we've checked so many times, so we're gonna cut. All right, so I'm cutting my fabric here. Now remember, even pressure on the rotary cutter, slightly moving your hand up and making sure, sorry, my cat just jumped on the table. Making sure, and it looks like I got a pretty even cut here that's gonna come right up for me. There we go. So we have our first cut on the piece of fabric for this quilt. That's very exciting. This is gonna make the solid square 6.5 inches, okay? All right, so now we have this super long, and I mean super long, you know, it's two-sided here. 2 sides to this super long piece of fabric. So what are we gonna do with it, all right? So now we are going to cut it into 6.5 inch squares. Lauren, excuse me, how do you do that? All right, so here's how we do this. Now, let me teach you a little bit about fabric, okay? So there are 2 types of fabric. The first kind is regular old fabric, right? Regular old fabric, that is going to look like this purple piece here. All right, if you go onto the back side of this fabric, it looks white. Not completely white, but the pattern is not bright and vibrant like it's supposed to be. This is the incorrect side of the fabric, all right, the incorrect side. This fabric also has at the bottom a very distinguished selvage edge, all right? This selvage edge cannot be used in your quilt because obviously it is white instead of purple, and we don't do tie-dye quilts unless you have tie-dye fabric. We want them to all be a uniform, nice color of the fabric that you've chosen. So the selvage edge has to come off. Now, the second type of fabric is actually one that I am using now. It is called a batik. A batik. It's a very strange word, but that's what it's called. It's called a batik. Batiks are going to be less likely to stretch, and they are going to be more expensive. I have expensive taste. I tend to like batiks. But batiks have the same print on one side as they do the underside, okay? They have the same thing on both sides. It's like you have completely immersed the fabric into the dye and it came out on both sides. So batiks are nice to use because then you do not have to worry about what side you sew together. So after you have this square, you can sew either side to the other pieces of fabric that you have available. It only gets confusing when you mix them, because when you mix them, you have to be careful if the other piece of fabric that you has a correct side, that you sew it to the correct side of that fabric, okay? And if you get a chain going, it can get a little confusing, but we'll get into that when we start sewing, all right? So this is a batik. All right, so batiks don't have a really true selvage edge. This one especially doesn't really have one at all, but you're gonna, it's very uneven at the bottom. All right, so this is gonna make up for the selvage edge, just as far as teaching goes, so that I can show you guys what to do. But you're gonna line this up on the, on the mat, and I'll show you this here in just a second. But you're gonna straighten this up on the mat and you're gonna cut off the selvage piece. My piece doesn't really have one, but I'm just gonna even up the edges so that when we make squares, one of them's not gonna come out bigger than the other. All right, here we go here. All right, so I lined it up. I did make sure this time, since I can, that the fabric is lined up completely with that yellow line on my cutting board. And then you're gonna make sure this line right here, this yellow line, is gonna be the one that I'm going to cut by. All right, so you want to have the smallest amount of fabric of each side of this, each selvage side, over so that you're cutting and wasting the least amount. So I probably need to shift mine a little bit this way. All right, and so then you can use your big ruler. You can use your little ruler because it is short enough. All right, you can use the little ruler, just make sure. All right, so here we ran into this. This is an advertisement. I can't make sure this is straight, so I'm gonna have to back this up a little bit more. All right, there we go. So here's the first line, so I can do this. So you're gonna, I'm running into this more because I'm trying to videotape it. I've never done that before while I was quilting, so just bear with me, guys. I do apologize. But here we go. All right, so we're making sure everything's straight, keeping that this line right here as straight as possible. So you're just gonna move that up a little bit. After you cut it, it likes to try and come apart on you. Don't let it. All right, so we're lining this up, lining that up. There we go, lining it up, lined up. And, oops. Now we're going to cut. All right, here's our rotary cutter. Holding my, so this ruler that I have, the short one, is going to be a lot more slippery than my other ruler. So I'm going to make sure that I have to keep pressure on the ruler, keep the pinky on the outside as you're cutting. All right, so there you go. Cut that off. Here's my little teeny tiny piece of fabric. So some pieces of fabric, small pieces of fabric, you can keep and put in your stash for extras as you go along. This little tiny piece, nah, don't keep it as a stash. Not worth it, just throw it out. All right, so we have our nice straight line here, and we are going to do the exact same thing with this small piece of fabric as we are with the large piece of fabric. If you don't have that second ruler, once you get a cut going, it is going to be much, much, much easier, for you to be able to count off your squares on your mat. All right, so I'm just gonna move that large piece of fabric. All right, so I'm gonna take my ruler and I'm going to measure 6.5. All right, measure 6.5. Here's what this looks like. All right, there we go, 6.5, lined up here at the top. And if you want to count it off, we can start from the back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then there's going to be your half. All right, so if you're doing it on your cutting board, here's what this is going to look like. All right, so you're going to line up the 1/2 inch, and you're just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5, and you're lined up with the 1/2 inch there. Not a big deal, pretty much the same thing. All right, so we have it lined up. Everything looks straight, everything looks great. All right, so there you go. We're gonna cut now. All right, here we go. Boom. All right, so remember how I told you that the fabric was folded over? I forgot to tell you not to unfold it now, because once you keep it folded over, when you're done cutting, you have 2 squares. All right, so you have your first 2 squares out of the whole quilt. And I'm sure that they are going to be just as square and nice as they can be. Double check them. Mine indeed are 6.5 inch squares, which is great. Even I get sort of nervous sometimes, especially the first time you do a pattern. You get into some crazy like 6 7/8 squares. Those are never fun. It really makes you appreciate your math teachers and how to read a ruler, because that was like, whoa, sorry, that was like a rude awakening for me a little bit too. You know, my mom was always right. I hate saying that. I hate admitting it. but you have 2. So now we're gonna get our pattern here. Pattern. So it's also sort of hard to read patterns sometimes. So if you have questions, please let me know. This says for bold print squares, which is what we're doing, bold print squares, using the measurement of your rail squares, cut 3 strips. All right, so that's 3 strips from your large piece of fabric that you got from the quilt store. So we have 1 done, and each strip is supposed to give you 6 squares, so 3 cuts, and that will give you 18 squares. Hello, this is my cat, Callie. Cats really like it when you quilt, so if you don't have a cat and you like to quilt, get a cat. They really enjoy it. Anyways, so you're gonna have 18 total 6.5-inch squares, all right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to finish cutting this first strip. Then I'm gonna let you guys go and do it on your own if you're not doing it now. If you have questions, I will be here finishing the rest of my squares just like everyone else. But I'll be here to answer your questions and things like that. All right, so we're gonna, Callie, sorry, again. She's really curious, she's a cat. So again, we're gonna keep cutting. So we're gonna do another cut, another 6.5-inch. All right, so we're gonna line it up. And you know, once you get a good thing going as far as keeping your fabric straight, if you don't, sorry, my cat. Sorry, if you, once you get a good thing going, you keep it going. Don't move your fabric. There's really no need for you to move your fabric unless you run out of room. So just leave it where it is, do a cut, it'll keep it straight, and then you can kind of see like, ooh, I didn't cut quite so straight, and you're typically gonna be on a line. You can straighten it up right there. Everything will be fine. So just kind of leave it as it is and get ready to cut. So we're straightening everything up. I am making sure everything is straight. I am checking, rechecking. 6.5. Make sure that it's going to be 6.5 and not 6. Make sure that you know the difference on your particular equipment. There should be some sort of designation as far as which is which. If you have questions, send me a picture of your ruler and I can help you. I know, Mom, I shouldn't be helping people. It's okay. I've gotten much better at this since I was in the 6th grade and ignored her advice. So here we go. Everything is straight. Everything's good to go. So I'm gonna cut. All right, so there's 4 of my squares. 4 out of 18. That's very exciting. Oops, I moved it on accident. All right, so I'm gonna move mine just so you guys can see a little bit better. And you know, make sure, so another thing to keep in mind, once you've cut your squares, get them off your cutting board because, you know, things kind of tend to start looking alike and you don't want to accidentally cut your square by accident. Trust me, I have done it. That's why I say that. Of course I've done it. Trust me, any mistake that you make, I have done so many times before. Tilly can attest to that. Definitely. If you have questions, just ask her. All right, so we are going to double check this cut again, making sure everything is lined up, everything is straight here. Everything is straight with my big ruler, with my little ruler. All right, and we are going to cut again. All right, so there's my 6 squares from the first cut of the fabric. So most of you are gonna have some leftover fabric like this, okay? And this obviously is not a 6.5-inch square that you can cut and get 2 more squares, but it might possibly be enough for you to unfold and get a 6.5-inch square. You never know. So I'm gonna measure it and just sort of see what I get. Because if you can get an extra square, I highly recommend that you do so. Even if you have a couple extra, or if you, in this case, have 3 extra, you can do an extra row to make your quilt a little longer. Some of them might be a little tick off, and this one might be more square. You never know what could happen with that extra piece. So if you have extra, just go ahead and cut that square, and you know, if nothing else, you have a really pretty piece for a scrappy quilt that you want to do in the future. You can always use fabric. Always use fabric. So actually, lucky me, this looks like it is, well, that's not. All right, so here we go. It is 6.5 inches one way, but not the other. So this is just going to be an extra piece of fabric that I have in my stash that I can use in the future. But you know, some of you might get an extra full square. If you do get an extra full square, unfold it. It's going to be really wrinkly where you have that crease from it being folded. I recommend you ironing that crease out so that you can be really accurate with your square cutting. But go ahead and iron that out. And then just measure all sides like you would the piece of fabric. So check. And you're going to cut off like a really tiny sliver. But all fabric is different lengths. So you might have a teeny tiny little piece left of the fabric that's definitely not going to be able to do anything for you. You might have a larger piece like mine that's almost big enough for a square. You might have one that's plenty big for a square. It just depends on the type of fabric, who makes it, things like that. All right, so we have cut our first squares. So before next week, you're going to need 18 6.5-inch squares from your bold print fabric that you're going to use as the solid square in the quilt pattern. I'll show you the pattern. It is going to be this one right here in the corner, center corner, and then it rotates. So that's going to be the one that you're going to need. 18 of for next week. If you have questions, I'll be around. Send me a Facebook message, send me an email. I'll be here, happy to answer your questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.